Yeah, unless she forgot something in school. You want to? Sure. All right, now this 1850 cabin was one of the buildings given to us by the Battle Creek Historical Society. They have also given us all the equipment we have in here, so I always like to give them a thank you when we go through here, just in case one of them comes through, they know how much we appreciate what they've done for us. Now in this log cabin, we tell the story about David Hewitt, the most honest man in Battle Creek. Now, remember, I told you there's going to be a mistake on the tape here. We'll see if you can catch it. Now, the year was, well, to hear David Hewitt's story, you really have to have the story before the story. The year was 1849, and Joseph Bates, who many consider the father of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, because he was the only old man. Everybody else when the church started was in their 20s and 30s. Joseph Bates was a retired sea captain. Now, he retired at the age of 38, but he was still the old man. Well, in 1849, he was on a preaching tour of northern Indiana. And one night, he had a dream. And in this dream, he was on a stagecoach. And that stagecoach was headed to the northeast. Well, he rode this stagecoach until it came to a town. But he woke up. He had no idea what the name of the town was. But he felt impressed that it was the Lord telling him, get on a stagecoach and go to the northeast. So he went down to the stagecoach company in South Bend, Indiana, and he paid his fare from South Bend, Indiana to the next town to the northeast. He rode that stagecoach there. He got off. He looked around that town. Nope, wasn't the town of his dream. So he paid his fare from that town to the next town to the northeast. Once again, he rode that stagecoach there. He got off, he looked around, and once again, it was not the town of his dream. Now, we're not sure how many times he did this, but it took him 3 days, and he went 140 miles from South Bend, Indiana to Jackson, Michigan, which is about 40 miles to the east end. When he got there, he got off that stagecoach, he looked around, and it was like, voila! It was the town of his dream. So he had him throw down his bag, and he went across the road and got a room for the night. Well, after he'd gotten a room in the hotel, he said to the hotel owner, are there any Millerite Adventists that live in this town? Well, the hotel owner says, yes, there's about 20 of them, and they meet in the home of a man by the name of Dan Palmer. There's Dan, there's his wife Abigail, which you're going to hear about later on in one of the other stories. Well, that really excited Joseph Bates, so he says, well, where do I find this Dan Palmer guy? And he was told that he had a very successful blacksmith shop on the main street of town. So Joseph Bates grabs his charts, similar to the one right there, he rolls them up, he puts them underneath his arms, and he heads off down the street. Now back in those days, those charts were very important to ministers. They would not leave home without them. Kind of like the laptops of ministers today. Well, Joseph Bates goes down to that blacksmith shop. He introduces himself to Dan Palmer and says that he'd like to preach to him. Well, Dan Palmer says, preacher, I'm a really busy man. You can preach as long as I can keep on working. Well, that was okay with Joseph Bates, so he puts up his charts. Daniel, Revelation, the 2300 days in the sanctuary, and he starts to preach. Well, most of these charts were very familiar to Dan Palmer. It was only 5 years since the Great Disappointment. The sanctuary chart, though, that was new, because that's where they had made their mistake, not understanding what the cleansing of the sanctuary was. So Joseph Bates starts to preach, and Dan Palmer starts shoeing horses. Joseph Bates continues to preach. Dan Palmer continues to shoe horses. But as he's getting closer and closer to that sanctuary chart, the hammer's starting to go slower and slower too. Finally, he lays down his hammer and he said, preacher, what'd you say your name was? Bates, was it? He says, you have the right message. They closed down the blacksmith shop. They went around to those another 19 Millerite Adventists, and within 2 weeks, they were all Sabbatarian Adventists. Well, we fast forward 3 years. Not the same journey. We fast forward 3 years. And Joseph Bates is once again in Jackson, Michigan. The year is 1852. Staying at the home of Dan and Abigail Palmer. And once again, Joseph Bates has a dream. Well, the next morning he goes down to Dan Palmer and he says, Dan, I've had another dream. Dan Palmer's probably thinking, all right, this Joseph is having dreams like Joseph of the Bible. What was it this time, Mr. Bates? Well, he says, I was on a ship. We were sailing into a place called Battle Creek. Well, now I'm sure Dan Palmer probably laughed and said, only you, Captain Bates, would think there was an ocean here in the middle of Michigan. There is no ocean, but there is a town called Battle Creek. So he says, how do I get there? And he was told to get on the early morning mail train and he could be there yet that morning. So that's what he did. When he got here to Battle Creek, it was a town of about 1,000 people. Joseph Bates had no idea why the Lord was sending him here. But he had this impression, almost like the Lord speaking into his ear, go talk to the postmaster. Go talk to the postmaster. So he walks into the post office and he says to the postmaster, a man by the name of Leonard Stewart, Sir, I'm looking for the most honest man in Battle Creek. He thought if he told that Sabbath message to that most honest man, that man would have to accept out of honesty. Well, the postmaster says, and you're looking for a man by the name of David Hewitt. See, everybody in Battle Creek knew David Hewitt for his honesty. He was a peddler, a door-to-door salesman. And if he should make a mistake, even if it was just pennies, he would stop what he was doing and he would walk back to make it right before he continued in business. So Joseph Bates says, well, where do I find this David Hewitt guy? And he was told that he had a house on the corner of Cass and Van Buren. So once again, Joseph Bates puts those charts underneath his arms and he heads off down the street. Well, David and Olive Hewitt were just sitting down for breakfast that morning when... So David Hewitt opens the door and there stands Joseph Bates. He introduces himself. Hello, my name is Joseph Bates, and I've been told, sir, that you're the most honest man in Battle Creek. If that is true, I have a message for you. But you know, nowadays we probably just wouldn't invite anybody to come walking into our house like that. And maybe they wouldn't have back then either. But David Hewitt remembered the verse in the Bible about entertaining strangers because they could be angels unaware. So he invited Joseph Bates in to have breakfast with him and Olive. Says that they had a wonderful breakfast together. But the whole time, David Hewitt's trying to size up who is this Joseph Bates and what's he all about. Finally, at the end of breakfast, he says, well, how would you like to have morning worship with us? Joseph Bates was an evangelist. You didn't want sermons? That was the wrong question to ask. Up went the charts, and Joseph Bates started to preach. He preached all morning. He preached all afternoon. He preached on into the evening. And that night, when morning worship got done, David and Olive Hewitt were Sabbatarian Adventists. When James and Ellen White moved to Battle Creek just 3 years later, there was a small congregation of Sabbatarian Adventists already meeting in the Hewitt home.
Oh, yeah.
All right, as I said, this stuff was all given to us by the Battle Creek Historical Society. Now comes quiz time. Anybody have any idea what this is?
You beat rugs with it.
Yeah, man, rug beater. I call it my original Hoover vacuum cleaner. They would hang their carpets up on the clothesline, and then they would beat the dust out of them. Now, some of my guesses last week were a giant whisk for eggs.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe dinosaur eggs. Thing for taking pizzas out of the oven. Don't think they had that in 1850. Giant fly swatter. Now, our flies aren't this big in Michigan, but our mosquitoes are getting that big. Quite often I hear from parents too, child motivator, probably secondary use. And this is called an adze. An axe, the head goes this way, an adze, it goes this way. Now, obviously, logs don't grow square in the forest. So this is how they would square them off. They would cut their log down with their axe, they'd stand across it, and then they would square it off. And as you can see, this is how this cabin was built in the 1850s. You can still see the adze marks in the wood. Now, if you wanted butter for your toast, you'd milk your cow, you'd skim the cream off the top, you put your cream in there, you put the lid on it, and then you'd get your most energetic child to making butter for the family. Now, incredibly, this 1850 cabin has running water in it. Yep, once again, you get that most energetic child. You put these buckets on their shoulder, you tell them the well is down at the corner, would you run and get us some water? Hence the running water. Now, if the water's not running fast enough, you can always use the child I don't recommend that, though. No. The flat iron. Many people that have used flat irons tell me that they used to have at least 3 of these because they cool off quicker than they heat up. So 2 of them would be on the stove, and they'd be ironing with the 3rd one. I've also had a lot of missionaries that have gone through here, and they had a kind that was called a self-heater. It was hollow, and they put charcoal in there, so it would heat up itself. Now, every once in a while, though, they would run out of charcoal, and then they would have to use twigs. They did not like using twigs because they would spark and put holes in their garments. So they always tried to have charcoal on hand when they started their laundry. This here, this is the bathtub. Now, because of the running water situation, this bathtub would get filled 1 time for the entire family. And guess who took their bath first?
The dad?
The oldest member of this family. And probably that would be Dad, because Mom would never admit she was older. But it was always the oldest member of the family. And guess who took their bath the last?
The smallest child?
The baby.
Yeah.
Now, remember that 39.9 years life expectancy? They were killing their kids. They did not understand germs back in those days. Nowadays, the baby would be the first one taking the bath. Everybody else would suffer if they needed to. Because yes, if you really consider it, Dad probably was the oldest member of the family. And Dad may have been working out in the pasture. So by the time Dad took his weekly bath, not his daily bath, his weekly bath, you can imagine how dirty that water was for the rest of the family. Now, you've all heard that statement, don't throw the baby out with the bath water? This is where it came in, because that water would be so dirty, you'd want to fish around in there, make sure all the babies were out before you threw the water out the back door. Aren't you glad we have faucets nowadays? Now in a cabin, something like this, Mom, Dad, and the youngest baby would stay downstairs. As a new baby would come into the family, the other one would go upstairs. So it was always Mom, Dad, and the youngest, because that was their only form of privacy back in those days. Now if that baby did become too old, it would go upstairs before another one came in the family. But that was their form of privacy, was to just have the youngest infant down with there. The rest of them would go upstairs, and the siblings would all be up together there. Now here you see a thing over there for making yarn, putting yarn on. We also have a thing for making the thread. And it just always amazes me how well balanced that thing is. You know, nowadays they would computerize that thing. I don't know how they would do it back in there, if it was trial or error or what. But I mean, that thing just keeps spinning and spinning and spinning. So very well balanced. Now the original door to the cabin here was right behind us right here. The stove used to be right here. But when you have so many people go through here, especially on Saturdays, it just works better to walk through than have them come in and out one door. So that's why we got the double door going right out through. We also have the laundry tub right there. All right. Well, what we can do is we'll go down that door there, we'll make a right, and we'll go over to Deacon John's house. Another place for the story. You know, that's...
Perto das outras?
Okay, this home here, this is the home of John and Betsy White. They were James White's parents. They raised a family of 9 out in the state of Maine. After they retired, they decided they wanted to live close to one of the kids. Well, they picked James and Ellen. James and Ellen White's house right directly across the road here. Now, when John and Betsy first moved here, this house was not ready for them yet. So they stayed in that lower right-hand room of James and Ellen White's house while this home was finished. Now, that room had already been put on James and Ellen White's house when the Harmons, Ellen White's parents, had also moved here, and their home wasn't ready. Now, the Harmon home used to be right down in the corner. That one we allowed to tear down. That one wasn't done by mistake, because we didn't have any good Harmon stories and it was in such bad shape. But because both the Harmons lived in there and John and Betsy did, we call that the in-law apartment of the house over there. Now, when John and Betsy moved here, they were not Seventh-day Adventists. In fact, John had been a deacon in Sunday churches for almost 40 years, and that's why this term, Deacon John White. It was a term that would stay with them the rest of their life and even into their death. If you go out to the graveyard there, you'll see on the tombstone, it'll say D.E.A. John White, and that's for Deacon John White. It was soon after they got here, though, that John and Betsy did become Seventh-day Adventists. But now they did something kind of strange. Not only did they start worshiping on Saturday, but they continued to go to worship on Sunday also, out of respect for all those friends they'd had for so many years. Now, we think that's kind of cutesy and everything else, but actually John White was way ahead of his time. You see, back in those days, whatever day you didn't worship on, you had to work. So who had the 5-day work week? John wasn't so dumb. Well, John also had a shoe repair shop in that back room right there. So the neighbors would come over here to have their shoes repaired. Well, one Sunday morning, Willie White, his grandson, came across the road. And there was John in there fixing somebody's shoe instead of getting ready for church. And he says to him, "Grandpa, don't you know what day it is?" John says, "Yeah, Willie, I know what day it is. But Grandpa," he says, "it's Sunday. How come you're not getting ready for church?" And he says, "You know, Willie, the Bible says to only keep one day holy. It only says to keep the seventh day holy." And ever after that, John and Betsy only kept Saturday as holy. Now, Betsy White died in January of 1871. John died in July of that same year. And I've had some people ask me what they died from. Well, I'm not really sure, but looking at John's picture, I'd say maybe sucking on lemons. Have you ever seen such a sour look on anybody's face in all your life? But I understand back in those days, it took as long as a minute for a picture to take, and it was easier to hold a frown than a smile. But I think John really took it to an extreme in that picture there.